I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that fight still continues today, and we've heard a bit about that during this weekend. And this final session today is kind of trying to bring together some of the different discussions we've had over the last 2 days. The title is Crisis and Resistance, Fighting Turnbull, Fighting the System. And we've got a very good panel of both international speakers and people from Sydney to give us a bit of a flavour and idea of, what that fight back is looking like today. So I'd like to begin with our first speaker, David Albrich. He's an Austrian socialist from our sister organisation, Turn Left. I won't try and pronounce the original. But he's also very active in the anti-fascist movement and a lead organiser in the Platform for Humane Asylum Policy. So I'll hand over to David to begin.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, comrades, again. Thanks for inviting me, for having me. I've learned a lot in the few days I've been here in Australia, in Melbourne, here in Sydney. The stakes are really high. When we look what happened since Trump got elected, we really have to build the movements and the resistance against Trump, against racism, against sexism, and against the capitalist system. The European Union summit in June marked a really dangerous turning point in the asylum policy, in politics in Europe. The mainstream parties, the governments all over Europe adopted to the far right by erecting new fences, by building up the borders, by letting more refugees drown in the Mediterranean. It has really been Trump that has built the alliances with far-right governments all over Europe. This led to some horrible increase in the death rates in the Mediterranean. And you can really see how this shift of politics to the right encourages far-right parties, fascist parties, and real street movements across the world. When you just think of what is happening in Britain at the moment, where 15,000 neo-Nazis marched in the streets in support of Tommy Robinson, the former English defense leader, attack squads that attacked a leading trade unionist in London, and neo-Nazis attacked a socialist bookshop, you can really think of how dangerous the situation is for the moment. And it has been in Austria, politicians of the Freedom Party coming out with the worst racism, with the Minister of Interior suggesting that we should concentrate migrants, should concentrate refugees again. In recent weeks, we have politicians from the Freedom Party coming out of registering Jews and Muslims again when they want to eat kosher or halal meat. Again, like the Italian Minister of Interior who wants to register Roma people again. In just recent days, it became known that in Austria, an asylum bid was rejected from one Afghan, one homosexual Afghan, and it was rejected because it says in the rejection, because he does not behave or clothe like a homosexual. So you can really see how the racism and other forms of discrimination of LGBT people, and so all come together, and this encourages of more of this stuff. What is actually happening? We see how climate change really at the moment fastens, where we have scientists saying that we're not just having a new warm period, but we are really facing a heat period where we come to some tipping points. I mean, the ruling classes also grip to austerity. They want to really let the working classes in all over the world pay for the crisis. So the challenges are really high. But again, on the other side, resistance is happening, is growing everywhere. Since Trump elections, I mean, it was so impressive to see the women's marches. We saw when Trump was trying to introduce the Muslim ban, people occupying the airports. We saw these fantastic climate marches, the marches for science, spreading not just in the US, but spreading all over the world. We see the anti-capitalist movement that really started with the massive battle in Seattle in 1999, coming again and again with last year this massive protest at the G20 protest in Hamburg. We saw the fantastic movements of in the Arab Spring, the revolutions from Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt spreading to Syria. And we recently saw again a glimpse of the Arab Springs with the mass uprisings in Jordan, with mass protests in Lebanon, and so on. And we're really taking up the fight in Europe. We are preparing for protest in September. We are preparing to protest the European Union Summit on Refugees on the 13th of September, and we are preparing to march from both sides of the border, from Germany and Austria, to meet in the middle to really tear down the fences of Fortress Europe. And you are going to fight Trump when he's coming in November. I hope you get as many people out onto the streets to make here life really helpful. And in order to do this, to challenge all these fights, we have to really build organizations. We have to build principled organizations that have a clear position against Islamophobia, against racism, sexism, on climate change, on austerity, on the capitalist system as a whole. And at the same time, this principled organization has to be flexible. We have to be united fronted. We have united fronts to work together with people who don't agree with us in all positions, but so we can have to organize the fight. I just give you an example how important this was. When there were the sexual assaults, the attacks in Cologne happening in Germany, it was a real disgusting racist offensive. The ruling classes all over Europe spread, and we saw Muslims, especially Muslim women, they feared to go out again. And what we did, we made a banner saying refugees and Muslims are welcome here. We were going to the campuses, we're going to mosques, speaking to Muslim people that we stand side by side with you. And at the same time, some neo-Nazis tried to organize a Pegida movement in Austria. We had, through the contacts with the mosques, because we've been there with our principled position, we got in contact with imams all over Vienna, and we organized a march against the Nazi demonstration where the Nazis just mobilized 300 and we mobilized several thousands, and we stopped Pegida from the beginning. And again, it was our principled position to the Freedom Party that at its core, it's a fascist organization led by right-wing fascist student corporations that allowed us to see how they were trying to build, again, they were trying to march against two refugee centers. They're trying to really build a fascist street wing in Vienna in two districts. And it was our understanding of the fascist party that we have to stop this immediately. And we, with the Platform for a Human Asylum Policy, mobilized again thousands, and we stopped the Freedom Party supporters again from marching, and we stopped them of having this street fighting wing. To come to an end, you have to build this principled and flexible organization now. We cannot wait anymore for anyone to build all this kind of stuff. We have to challenge racism wherever we can, whether it is the racism against refugees, against Muslims, against Asian people, or any other. We have to fight discrimination, and we have to fight with the victims of the racism. We have to have them on board. We have to fight side by side. Wherever fascists are trying to mobilize on the streets, we have to crush them from the very beginning. We could see in Germany what could happen if we don't fight them. In the city of Dresden, where Pegida was formed, it was not confronted by the anti-fascists, by the anti-racists, and they grew bigger and bigger from Monday to Monday. We have to be there when they are trying to march. If it's in Europe, in the US, in any other country, as it is in Australia. And we really have to build this kind of radical left alternative now, because it's often the right-wing parties that can use the anti-establishment mood for their own gains and put it in a racist, in a nationalist direction. We really, as revolutionary socialists, have to lead the fight against austerity, against the capitalist system as a whole. So I wish you all the best in doing the fight. Join Solidarity, join the fight, join the revolution. Thank you for having me here.
From Austria to New Zealand now, our next speaker is Danni Wilkinson. She's a New Zealand socialist and active in the Nurses Union, where they've actually had a lot of recent experience of industrial action and also lessons from fighting under a Labor government, which might be very important for us coming into an election. So, Danni.
Kia ora, everybody. Just like to say, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be here this weekend. In particular, thank you to Mark and Maria for affording me the hospitality of staying in your house. It's been amazing. I've learned a whole lot, and I'll take a lot back to my comrades back in New Zealand. I'd like to kind of talk primarily about what the nurses have gone through in the last 12 months in regards to our protests and our strike and trying to get a better deal and a better healthcare system for nurses in New Zealand. We've had a multi-pronged fight. We've had to fight with our union to take action. We've had to fight with the bosses. We've had to fight the government. And we're also fighting sort of public perception, this idea that nurses are caring people and angels. And I think that distracts from the idea that we're well-trained healthcare professionals who happen to care, but our primary job is to look after your health. And so by introducing this idea that nurses are angels, that introduces this idea of a martyrdom. And I think that there's a lot of oppression in that. And I think that's used to oppress and suppress the idea that nurses should be taking strike action, should be standing up for our needs, should be making sure that we're able to look after you, but also look after ourselves. So that's been a really massive fight, is trying to shift that public perception. And I think that's going to be a massive ongoing one, not just for us in New Zealand, but for you guys as well. I don't know about you, but I've been told repeatedly nurses are angels. I ain't no fucking angel. So at the end of last year, our contract was up for negotiation, and our union and the district health boards, and we have 20 of them in New Zealand to look after the health of about 6,000 people. So a lot of money spent in bureaucracy for a start. But our union sat down with the health board bosses and said to them effectively, our staff want some more money and they want staffing fixed. They didn't go with a sort of set expectation in mind. They put it back to the health board bosses and said, okay, what are you going to do about these problems? So issues-based bargaining, problematic right from the get-go. And the district health boards came back with an offer of 2% a year for 3 years. Now, unfortunately, that wasn't enough. 15 years ago, we got a 20% pay rise, and since then we've just barely kept up with inflation, but we haven't kept up with the growth that was enjoyed by other industries. So the median wage growth in New Zealand went up about 15% over that 20 years, 15% higher, than our growth had been. So for us, for catch-up, 6% wasn't going to cut it, 15% was just going to cut it. And then when we compared that to the Health Minister and the Prime Minister's growth, that also gone up sort of 12 to 16% higher than our growth had been, and even the minimum wage had gone up a lot faster. Doesn't take into account the increase in cost of living. Housing prices in Auckland particularly have gone up about 60% in that time period. So an offer of 6% over a 3-year period was woefully inadequate. So we turned that offer down despite the recommendation from our health board, from our union that we accept it, and that was quite. I think that sort of triggered a series of events that the union weren't particularly happy with, but they had to deal with. So there were lots of promises in the preceding years. We'll sort you out next time. Global recession, we'll sort you out next time. Christchurch earthquakes, we'll make sure you get better pay next time, but we've got to give the money to Christchurch to fix the earthquake damage. And then there was the expectation of a Labour government being voted in. Take a low offer this time, Labour will sort you out next time. And so when they came back under a Labour government with this pitiful offer of 2% a year, I think a lot of nurses were really pissed off. Rightfully so. Not just talking nurses too, we're also talking about healthcare assistants, so they're the people who do those basic cares, showering patients, turning them, and also midwives, so the people who are delivering babies. So there's promises over a 15-year period, and we believed them. We slept through this period. We were very apathetic as an industry, and we just accepted the bullshit basically that was thrown at us. In February of this year, 2 nurses who remained anonymous started a Facebook page called New Zealand Hear Our Voices, and it was to share stories. And within a couple of weeks, that page had grown to about 50,000 members, and yeah, massive growth. And nurses from all over the country were sharing stories about their work conditions, and most of those stories were horrific. We had a nurse who works in Hill Moulton Hospital in Christchurch was talking. It's a mental health facility, talking about how staffing was so inadequate in her hospital that staff are being assaulted on a daily basis to the point where head injuries that are keeping staff off work for weeks and weeks, sometimes months at a time, major injuries. And this is occurring on a daily basis and as a direct result of unsafe staffing. So that's only one example, but throughout the country in sort of every department, massive problems with staffing. So then we started looking at the idea that it wasn't just money that we were after, we need to sort the staffing out, but also this discontent that actually we shouldn't have to think about staffing as part of our pay negotiations. That should be the government and the health board's responsibility. So again, a lot of pissed off nurses that we're having to fight, not just for ourselves, but now for the whole country. So this movement on Facebook kept growing, and then International Nurses Day came up in May, and massive marches were organised throughout the country, just by nurses, by healthcare assistants, rank and file union members, and at this point they had kind of the blessing of the union, and a petition was started around staffing as well. So on the 12th of May, nurses took to the streets and we marched, presented a petition at Parliament with thousands and thousands of signatures asking the government to have a good look at the staffing issues and seeing what we could do about it. From there, a lot of media work was done to try and raise awareness of what we were looking at. Organised a rally around safe staffing to sort of increase public awareness that we weren't just fighting for money and we weren't being greedy, because that started getting thrown out. And that staffing was a massive issue, and that going with staffing comes money. You can't expect to attract and retain staff in a country where staff are unpaid or underpaid if you don't pay them properly. A lot of our nurses are coming here to you guys because you pay your nurses a lot better. So trying to just raise awareness around that as well, that you can't fix the staffing issue without paying nurses a bit more. We got a lot of media interest. The union stopped talking, so I started, and the union wasn't very happy about this. They wanted to shut me up. There was a lot of kind of trying to discredit me. Oh, she doesn't even work in the hospital anymore. Well, I did, but not full time. And just a lot of kind of quiet, subtle digs, emails going out to members saying, don't listen to Danni Wilkinson, she doesn't know what she's talking about. But never any kind of direct, trying to point out where my facts were wrong, but just a sort of quiet thing. momentum really slowed. The government offered to do an independent panel kind of review into our paying conditions and came back with this idea that we should have 3% a year for 3 years instead of 2% a year for 3 years. And of course the DHBs adopted that, and so that was the recommendation that we were given. That was the offer that we were given, and then of course our union recommended that we take this 3% a year for 3 years, and they offered us 500 more nurses. Now New Zealand's not a massive country, we've got about 4.5 million people, but divided into every hospital, every ward, every shift, each shift was going to get about 0.07% of a nurse. So if you need a helping hand, that's about all you're going to get. This deal was going to cost about $500 million. So not a huge amount of money, I didn't think. We turned that deal down. Voted to say no. So they went back to the negotiating table. We voted in the meantime that we were going to strike, and 2 dates were set aside, the 5th and 12th of July. And again, a lot of talk around this. Nurses are caring professionals, they don't want to go on strike. Well, hell yes, I want to go on strike. Bring it. So they went back to the negotiating table, another offer was presented, and so the first strike was called off. Much to everyone's disappointment, no member engagement around that decision. The offer was released after they called off the first strike, and it was the same offer. 3% a year for 3 years, 500 new nurses, but we'll add 2 extra steps. So in New Zealand, nurses, you work for 5 years, you no longer get pay rises, that's it. So they introduced 2 extra steps, so you get 6 years and 7 years, and then you cap out. So that was kind of their concession. We turned that down. Yay. And then we took strike action on the 12th of July, which was amazingly empowering. Yeah. So on the 12th of July, once again, nurses took to the streets. We had 24 hours off work. We had to negotiate the idea of life-preserving services, and we weren't going to be allowed to strike unless we could provide staff to cover to make sure no one died. So it turns out only about half the nurses were able to strike, and in some wards they were better staffed on strike days than they are on normal day, because the calculations done to ensure that no one died and that the minimum staff required actually turns out higher than is on a normal day. But this was the only day it was legally enforceable. So another offer was presented to us not long after we took strike action, same offer once again. In the meantime, our industrial services team had said categorically, we believe the government line, there is no more money. And then the next day the government turned around and spent $2.3 billion on aeroplanes. And that the industrial services team also turned around and said, we have no intention of issuing further strike ballots, we will do no further industrial action. So the next offer was presented, same offer again, and unfortunately, about a week and a half ago we voted to accept this offer. However, in 18 months' time we have a pay equity deal coming up, and so we're hoping that we'll be able to look at nursing as a female-dominated industry, compare it with a similar male-dominated industry, and come to some sort of agreement that perhaps is worth a bit more money. And because the negotiations took so long, then we start again in a year and a half's time. So while that fight's sort of put to the side for now, we're sort of building for the next one. But just like to say, in terms of striking under a Labour government, that was only kind of one facet in the fight. It was a matter of a whole bunch of stars aligning for us, really. 15 years of inadequate pay rises and a massive online social media kind of platform, I think, really built the fight. It was the Labour government. We were sort of told they'll do better for you, but also don't push them too hard because you'll piss them off and they're our friends. So it was a fight on that struggle as well. Labour government was only kind of one very small part in that, and I'll leave that there.
Our next speaker is Rita Mallia. She's the Construction Union's New South Wales president, and I think a lot of people in this room will already be aware that the CFMEU is a very militant union and has been at the forefront of fighting back against the Turnbull government and their quite draconian policies from the ABCC on ABCC, yeah. But we'll hear more from Rita.
Thanks for the invite, and so I'm here on behalf of the Construction, Forestry, Maritime, Mining and Energy Union now. I want to acknowledge my MUA comrades that are here today. And also I want to acknowledge we meet on Aboriginal land and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I want to thank all of you. It's always great to be here amongst comrades, and I want to thank all of you for your ongoing support of the CFMEU, because it has been a bit of a battle, but we obviously can't fight that battle with all of our comrades outside of the trade union movement, and particularly comrades like yourselves. So I'm thinking about today and listening, sort of seeing what's the events that have unfurled in Parliament in the last week or so, and thinking about democracy. It's really very clear that our democracy is kind of broken in this country, and that really what we're facing here is a class struggle of really quite enormous proportions, and despite the fact that politicians and the media pundits, etc., want to deny that such a thing exists. The idea of a democracy that empowers people clearly is not one that we have in existence today, and it's really fundamental democratic rights that are under attack, and politically I think we've lost our way, both under Conservatives and probably any alternative government, unless we stand up and fight back. In our world, in the construction industry in particular, but also in the maritime industry, we've just got the state. It's just an unabated attack by the powers of the state. We've got the Australian Building and Construction Commission, which is basically a bunch of lawyers and former federal police officers who shadow our officials and just spend most of their $38 million or so a year prosecuting us. And there's not many CFMEU officials, myself included, who aren't being prosecuted for doing our jobs. We now have the Registered Organisations Commission, which is trying to, kill us by, administrative standards and governance standards, well over and above, publicly listed companies. And I've got no problem with governance. I'm a lawyer by trade. I've got no problem with being accountable to our members and making sure that we use members' resources in a way that's not wasteful, and it is a way that is absolutely in the interest of promoting their interest and their conditions. But really what the Rock's trying to do is just make it almost impossible for us to operate. And this week we've had the ACCC come into the fray, and we've got the government using its purchasing power to basically black ban companies from doing government work if we fly union flags and wear union stickers. Well, I don't know if you've seen all the flags around town. We're not really paying very much attention to that edict, but it's really quite extraordinary how they want to criminalise trade unions in this country and trade union activity. But we've seen their absolute failure to try to charge and convict John Setka and Sean Reardon, our Secretary and Assistant Secretary in the Victorian branch, of blackmail for basically an industrial dispute that they took on behalf of the members there in construction. That spectacularly failed as soon as it came to committal. But now we've got the ACCC deciding to use its powers to prosecute our ACT branch for price fixing and cartel behaviour. It's just all out of salt. It just never stops. We're hoping that this is a last desperate attempt by the state to curtail union activity and collective action. But I guess we'll have to see. We've all been we've been subject to massive fines, as you would have read. We've been fined, my branch, $2.4 million for a 1.5-day strike in support of a delegate that was monstered by its multinational employer. And you've got companies like Grocon, one of the builders who has one building site in Sydney, who doesn't pay its subcontractors, killed 3 members of the public in Victoria 3 years ago and only fined $250,000. So the double standard is extraordinary to me. And I was reading this morning, there's a federal court judge who's just retired, Richard Tracy, who hates us, who was saying in his farewell speech, I've had a great time as a judge, and by the way, the government should do something about the dastardly CFMEU. So I don't know, we're everybody's obsession. We've got union officials now being individually fined, and the High Court finding that we can't actually ask the union to pay the fines for us. And yet you've got the Commonwealth Bank, in the last couple of weeks admitting to 15,000 criminal breaches of the corporations law, and the NAB stealing people's superannuation money and, charging fees to dead people or for services not rendered. And I doubt very much, and I won't be holding my breath, that those people will be held to account in the way that union officials are. We're seeing workers being locked out for hundreds of days by their multinational corporation employers to basically complicit with the government and the media, quite frankly, to beat them into submission to support really shitty outcomes when it comes to enterprise agreements. Having said that, we've got about 100 or so mobile crane operators who've just voted 90% in 2 companies to take protected action, or industrial action, in the coming weeks to support their wages and conditions. So there is an appetite for people to take strike action, protected or otherwise, to further their claims. And the call for a right to strike is actually so fundamentally important in this. The government wants to dismantle worker power when it comes to their own retirement incomes and superannuation. Obviously, they're very scared of workers having the power over trillions of dollars and the impact that might ultimately have on the economy and as a force for collective good. And like I said, it's just this unabated attack on workers' rights that's in bed, I suppose, the inequality that we see in so much part of our society. And I suppose for me, the failure is epitomised by the arrogance of the Turnbull government in rejecting the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the continued systematic discrimination that our First Nation brothers and sisters suffer. It's just really got to stop, and I suppose we could all just think, oh my God, this is all too hard, we'll just resign now and give up, and it's so inspiring to be on this panel with such inspiring comrades. But workers in the past didn't give up. They did take strike action. They did fight for the conditions that many of us have taken for generations for granted. And certainly as union officials and as union members and union activists, we can't betray that legacy. And it is a class struggle that we wage, and we're up for taking it. We don't want to accept legal structures and processes that basically embed the benefits for a few rich people and leave everybody else begging at the door. So for unions like the Construction, Forestry, Maritime, Mining and Energy Union, the only way to respond to this erosion of fundamental rights is to organise workers on the job, elect delegates and to take action where we've got to take action, not just to improve wages and conditions. It's more than that. It's actually about changing culture and about changing the community and the world in which we live. So we've got a conservative government, and the media is pretty crap in this country, quite frankly, including the ABC for some reason have also got out for us. And we're portrayed as thugs and bullies. I've been described as being part of a criminal enterprise. In the face of all of that, our members continue to grow. We get really good outcomes where we are organised, and we're pretty committed to taking that militant union workplace approach. That's the key for us, and that's that's basically how we see our success. I know different unions have different ways of doing things, but for us it's on the ground, and I think history has shown that. We're also putting a lot of pressure on Labor as an alternative government to make some real change. At the end of the day, we're being prosecuted under laws that they kept or developed. The Fair Work Building Commission was a creature that they kept in place, which then became the ABCC. So from our perspective, there's unfinished business with the alternative political party. We've only got 2 choices really in this country. So we're hoping that everyone gets behind this campaign. It's not just about changing the rules for us, it's actually about really throwing everything out and starting again. We get no justice in the Fair Work Commission, we get no justice in the Federal Court. The whole regime that was set up to try and promote workers' rights back then after the shearers' strikes just doesn't exist in this country today. And we've just got to get out onto the street. We've got to educate, not talk amongst the people like ourselves who are committed. We've got to start talking to people out there who who haven't joined unions. Maybe they haven't been asked. Maybe there isn't a union necessarily that they know exists in their sector. We've got to actually be starting to talk to people who are not just us, who are very well aware of the challenges that we have in front of us. Obviously, we've organised our rally, and I think our Committee of Management and Delegate Dennis McNamara spoke at the Right to Strike session yesterday about the rally on Thursday, the 6th of September. And that's come about basically as a call from our rank and file members, particularly young construction workers who had a bit of a taste of some pretty successful rallies last year, but also just want to take up the fight to be able to provide a good outcome for their families and to live not so much under the pressure that they do and beyond in terms of what we're seeing and the stresses that many of our members face. So hopefully we'll see you all out there. We want to try and get as many people out on the streets as possible. We'll certainly have most of our members in most of our sites in and around town and beyond coming to that rally in the face of whatever fines, penalties or laws we might have to be found to be in breach of. I'm not really quite sure. It's just continual, like I say. But it's really important that we don't give up the right to protest. We've had shitty laws passed in New South Wales to prevent people from coming together collectively. They know, our enemies, that the power is in the collective. It is about people coming together, and it is about all of us forming a group that takes on these forces, and I think we've just got to continue to fight back, and as the comrade said, just get as many people out there as we possibly can and tell a different story, and one which hopefully can inspire others outside of our movement to take up the fight and see things changing. So thank you again. I want to really thank you for all your support over many years of the CFMEU and our members. We do certainly appreciate it and look forward to seeing you out there on Thursday the 6th of September. Thanks, guys.
Panel speaker is Caitlin, who's active in the refugee movement, but also proudly a member of Solidarity, the organisation that's put on this conference, Keep Left. So hand over to Caitlin.
In the session before this, in the session on police violence, someone made a very good point that, in a strange way, us coming together to tell stories about, people, oppressed and marginalised people telling stories about police brutality actually brings us together in a strange way. And it reminded me of the magnificent rallies that we saw in London in response to Trump's visit over there, and the way that actually brought together people who are under attack from, by everything that Trump represents, transgender people, refugees, Muslims, migrants, trade unionists and the rest of it that are also under attack from Theresa May in the UK and across Europe. But I think, it's easy to forget between these high points and rallies when we all go back to our campaigns just how, connected all of these struggles and oppressions and so forth are, and I think that's what we try to do here at Keep Left and in Solidarity in general is to connect those dots and bring those struggles together. And I was at a meeting in London in July actually, where we heard from people from across Europe talking about the brutal cuts and austerity, the political polarisation, the ramping up of anti-refugee racism and Islamophobia in particular. And it was both terrifying to hear of the rise of the far right across Europe, but also heartening to hear that there's resistance everywhere. But what struck me as well was how familiar it all was. And in some ways, I think much of what is happening across Europe is happening in Australia in slow motion. We may not have been hit by a crisis as deep and severe as that which has plagued Europe for the last 10 years, but there's nothing special at all about Australia actually. It could just as easily happen here. So I think we need to take heart from the struggles in Austria, in the US and elsewhere, but also need to take heed of just how savage our rulers can actually be when their power and profits are threatened. And I think here in Australia, Turnbull and the coalition continue to rule for the rich as they drive through cuts to penalty rates, billions of dollars worth of tax cuts, and pour more billions into propping up a failing coal industry. They use the same tactics of scapegoating, fear-mongering, xenophobia as the ruling classes of Europe. And people around the world were shocked to see images of children in cages along the US border earlier this year, but we all know that our own government has been locking up refugee children and tearing apart families for years now. There's a 12-year-old boy that's now at risk of dying from hunger strike on Nauru as we speak. And the politics of Fortress Europe have existed for decades in Australia here now. And as David pointed out yesterday, of Sebastian Kurz in Austria, the right around the world has been looking to Australia for many years, to emulate our brutal border regime. And I think the last week alone has been enough to show us that we can't rest on our laurels when it comes to racism and the far right, from Fraser Anning using his maiden speech to call for a final solution for refugees to an actual Nazi being on Sky News. The right here is also gaining confidence from Trump. And One Nation's vote also grew to 16% in some places during the by-elections last Saturday. But we have to remember that their racism comes out of the swamp that's been created by the mainstream in recent years. Not only the racist border regime, but the intense Islamophobia and rounds of anti-terror laws. And it's in this climate that you could have a Pakistani student at Newcastle University last week punched in the face with a knuckle duster and told to go back where you came from. So I think while we need to shut down the far right, wherever they show their hideous faces, it's the task of the left to fight the racism of the mainstream and direct people's anger towards our real enemy, Turnbull and the bosses. Because the situation in Europe should be a warning to us all. We need to build an anti-racist, pro-refugee movement here and now before a crisis on the scale of the global financial crisis hits Australia before a serious fascist movement can be built here. And you know, as the Liberals' popularities continue to plummet, they've continued to rely on racism to try to shore up support. You know, actually fairly unsuccessfully, I think we have to say. But their most recent target has been the Sudanese community in Melbourne. You know, with their attempts to drum up hysteria around these non-existent African gangs. And I think the response from the South Sudanese community and activists in Melbourne, in organising rallies outside Channel 7, is a spectacular example of how you can fight back. And I think the placards that have been a feature of those rallies sum up precisely what it is we need to argue, and that's racist gangs out of Parliament. So the coalition are very much on the back foot, and I think they have been for months now. You know, they've lost to Labor in the last, I think, 35 or so opinion polls. Their attempts to win back favour through income tax have failed miserably. They didn't win a single seat in the by-elections, and the front page of the telly today said death row panic for Turnbull about his capitulation to the right of his party on the national energy scheme. So I think we can take heart from that, and I think, you know, they can essentially be knocked down with a feather. And I think, but we have to keep in mind that the coalition has already done an extraordinary amount of damage since being in power. You know, we've seen 17,000 jobs gone from the public service, millions more dollars have been ripped out of our universities. It's harder than ever to access Centrelink. And while we won the vote on so-called in the marriage equality plebiscite, they unleashed a wave of homophobia, particularly transphobia, that we're still dealing with today. And you know, it's almost certain that by this time next year we're going to have a Labor government. And I think we can be pleased that they've pledged to reverse penalty rate cuts at this point, and have committed to changing at least some of the rules that have seen our unions straitjacketed for years, and also that Shorten came out and condemned Anning's racist speech last week. But we know, and I think history shows us, that we cannot rely on a Labor government to deliver on even some of our most basic demands. And I think no amount of door knocking is going to win us back the right to strike. And as Arima and others have said during the conference this weekend, you know, we need to, and our excellent banner up here, we need to break the law in order to change the law. And you know, bad rules are there for the breaking. I think this is a battle that needs to be fought and won on the ground, and I think that's the same for all of the campaigns that we're involved in. That we're involved in. And you know, the CFMEU and the MUA have provided an excellent lead to other unions in this fight, and we're proud to stand alongside comrades from these unions to build this struggle. And for that reason, I urge everyone to go out, and build the rally on September 6th. As hard as they can, you know, to knock down the ABCC and to win back our right to strike. Yeah, because I think we need to build a left that will not only take down Turnbull, but that will also continue to campaign under Labor to confront the scapegoating that also comes from Labor around refugees and migrant workers, and to make damn sure that we get our penalty rates back. To win the right to strike and to close the offshore processing centres for good, because we know that cuts, crisis, and racism come as a package deal, and they need to be fought all together. And we know that none of these are about to go away. I think 2018 is a good year to remember that lesson. As anyone knows who's come to a solidarity meeting this year, 2018 is a year of anniversaries. There was May 1968 in France, when workers and students rose up to challenge their government there, an uprising against Stalinism in Czechoslovakia. In that same year, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, and the response to that, mass uprisings in Indonesia. And of course, 100 years since the end of World War I, when workers around the world rose up against their ruling classes to end the industrial scale bloodshed. These are events that change the world forever in their ways, and from which we draw very rich lessons on how best to fight. It's not just that we like having meetings about interesting pieces of history, but they also show us, I think, that the system in which we live, capitalism, is a system that produces crises time and time again, and which calls for people to resist and fight time and time again. And as time goes on, these crises become more and more severe. It's the same system that drove the world into the horror of the First World War that has serious conflicts brewing between China and the US, and that has destroyed half of the Middle East. The same system that shows no regard for human life, that is now destroying the planet and has us teetering on the edge of catastrophic climate change. But the force that keeps this system going is also the only force that has the power to overturn this system. The people who dig up the coal, who drive the trains, who build our cities, who look after us when we're sick and pregnant, who fly the planes carrying people across borders, and also who churn out profits for the ruling class every year. We're the ones that can bring it all to a grinding halt. But we also know that the kind of racism and even fascism that we've talked about at this conference thrive on misery and despair. And there's a reason, I think, why One Nation and Pauline Hanson are doing so well in areas like parts of the Hunter region that were once union and labour strongholds, where coal mines and industry have been shut down and people thrown out of work, onto dole queues. Places where there's been no real fight for jobs and no political force to confront the racist scapegoating. That's where the politics of despair can set in. People have to know that there's an alternative to both the cuts and the racism, and that alternative is struggle. And to fight for secure jobs, a decent wage, for more hospital beds, proper public transport and the rest of it. People need to feel their own power to actually challenge the system that grinds us all down. And I think that's why the question of the right to strike is so important and so central to our struggle in Australia at the moment, and why Solidarity has thrown itself into building this fight. And it's not just a matter of striking to win decent pay and conditions. Actually, the ability to withdraw our collective labour is the greatest strength that we have to fight back against the system at large. And our ruling class knows this very well, and that's why they're so determined to deny us this right. They look at something like the Lady Salento hospital workers refusing to let baby Asha be taken off to the hellhole of Nauru. They see the CFMEU workers extending their solidarity to childcare workers on strike, and they're terrified. And they should be. They should be terrified, because it's extremely powerful. And I think it's that power. It's the power of workers, working in transport and in the planes in the US that can stop Trump's deportations. And it's the same here. The same here in Australia. We need to build the movement for refugees and against deportations. Just to finish up, on a very popular line, but that I think rings true and is worth reinforcing. The German revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg said that fights for individual reforms under capitalism is much like the labour of Sisyphus, an endless struggle to push a boulder up a hill, only to see it roll back down again. And many of the struggles that we have today feel just like this. Well, what's been won in the past is being taken away, and we're struggling to hold on to just some of it. But Luxemburg also said that pushing a boulder up a hill over and over will give us very strong muscles, and we have to throw ourselves into all of those struggles and win or lose, build those muscles to build the fight against the whole neoliberal austerity agenda and ultimately against the capitalist system itself. But I want to say we also can't rely on that strength alone. And I think the period of 1968 that we've reflected on goes to show that we can't rely on strength alone. If we're to defeat this system, we need to be organised. We need to be more organised than our enemies, and they're unfortunately very well organised. We need to bring together our experiences from all our different campaigns and workplaces and build an organisation that can help connect and lead these struggles and connect the dots in the same way that we saw those dots connected at the Trump rally in London. So if you like what you've heard this weekend, don't leave this conference just as an individual with some slightly more radical notions than you had on Friday. I urge you to join Solidarity, to become part of an organisation that's committed to putting those ideas into practice, to fighting Turnbull, fighting sexism, fighting for refugees, the right to strike, for Indigenous rights and against climate change. We need more people to build more of those struggles. Because if fascism is the politics of despair, socialism is the politics of hope. And that's the hope that we can fight back against this sick system and build a world that's free from oppression and exploitation. And I urge you to join us in the fight for that world.
We've only got got time for a couple of comments. I'll give you a tap at 3 minutes, but if you want to just we'll just take a couple. Lucy? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thanks to all the speakers and for everybody this weekend. It's been a really galvanising weekend. I think one of the things, Caitlin, you were talking about 2018, the sense in which people are open to really questioning and critiquing and expressing their hatred of the system. I've never felt that people, just regular, workplace conversations, people willing to say, what, capitalism really sucks. It feels like that is a live question, and people are really looking for opportunities to condemn it, but groping around for a way to do it. And I think that a lot of the themes of the weekend and the politics that have come out of the weekend are about connecting up all of those quite raw struggles about economic demands and union struggles against austerity and for economic justice, and connecting those things with really strong political campaigns, for the right to strike, against women's oppression, for refugee rights, against police repression, and being able to join those two things in a very conscious way, so that people know, for example, exactly as Danni said, that when nurses are going out on strike, they're going out on strike and proving that they deserve rights as women too, and that their work is not diminished because they're caring. When we're demanding, for example, refugees need rights, we need to close the camps. Solidarity is one of the only organisations that consciously pushes refugee rights activists to orientate to the working class, because we know that that is the class and that is the place with the power and the rooted politics that can see a different kind of world, and that a different kind of world is possible. But I do think that it requires very, very conscious class politics to do that, and that doesn't come organically. It does require a lot of thought, a lot of discussion, a lot of joining of the dots as we've done this weekend, and putting it into practice and trialling over and over again to join those dots. So I echo all of the things that Caitlin and all the speakers said about drawing out those lessons and coming together as an organisation and continuing the class fight and the class struggle.
Yeah, it was great to hear from the panel, and I really enjoyed hearing from Danni, and also great to have you here, Rita, but also the striking teacher who spoke this morning. And I think actually hearing that detail of that, like, struggles don't just come from nowhere. People don't just appear on the street. There's always like someone or some group of people behind it, organising, having those discussions, having those debates. Struggle is pretty much a constant process of debate, because if we were already all agreed, we'd already have won and overthrown the bosses and overthrown capitalism. I just want to go back to actually what happened with the Sydney trains earlier in the year, where the train drivers, sorry, not just the train drivers, but all of the Sydney train employees, their legal ballasted strike was overturned by the Fair Work Commission because of the Fair Work Act and the laws in that act that allow strikes to be terminated if they pose significant economic damage to the economy, which, as Gigi put so well, is exactly the point of a strike. That was a real flashpoint, I think. It was all over the news. It got discussed on Q&A. It was really a wake-up moment for the union movement, actually, about the extent of how much that right has been taken from us. And that could have gone either way. It could have gone into a complete defeat, which in a short-term sense it was, because the strike was cancelled. The union called it off in response to that court ruling, and the members accepted the deal that was put to them. But actually out of that, because there was a group of people who decided to take up this fight, we now have a right to strike movement. And to put it to put it in clear terms, actually a group of people in this room, Solidarity members, stood outside a delegates meeting of train workers with a petition saying what happened to you shows that we need the right to strike, and a leaflet saying we would have supported you if you would have walked out anyway. And that was actually the beginning, I think, of what we have now as this right to strike sort of slogan that has, you know, been able to get carried also by the fact that we have this bigger ACTU Change the Rules campaign that's relating to, you know, a particular mood, and it's all those things sort of coming together. But, you know, it's very, the point I'm making is that actually a very small group of people with clear politics can make a really big difference. Small cogs can turn bigger wheels. You know, the militant unions that are calling people out on the 6th, that will have a broader effect, you know, on the broader union movement. Revolutionaries might be a very small group of people in their unions, but, you know, we can find other people in other unions and come and, you know, bring together to push these slogans. And I think the fact that actually now we have secretaries from several major unions writing right to strike articles in the paper talking about it on national television, you know, actually that demand has really got taken up the ranks. People should come to the 6th, but they should also take those leaflets back to their workplaces, if possible move a motion in your union and see if you can, you know, get strike action or delegates leave from your union, because, you know, we can't do it alone. It can't just be 2 unions. We need to build, you know, a bigger cog can turn an even bigger wheel.
We're going to have a very busy time over the next few months. But I think in the last week we've got a sniff of what the Tories, what the Conservatives here, what the Liberals have got in mind. I mean, the fact that they could publicly be talking about getting rid of Turnbull and giving us Dutton, you know, as their alternative, that's who they think represents them, and it does. He represents all that is most, you know, evil and corrupt and disgusting, you know, about the Liberals. And if there was ever a reason we had to actually fight hard to get rid of Turnbull and Dutton, I think it's that when their backs to the wall, they look to Dutton, and I think we want their backs to the wall. But I think we've also got a little sniff of what their desperation means. I mean, the fact that Anne could actually raise the question of the financial solution, final solution, in his speech in Parliament, that there were, you know, all the coalition MPs actually shook his hand. They found a little bit of courage, you know, subsequently. But as we discussed yesterday, I mean, all the politics that substantiate his talk about the final solution have actually come from Dutton. They've come from Turnbull. They've come from the politicians of the coalition side. And I think that's what makes the 6th, I think, particularly important. Because our fight between now and when we get rid of Turnbull is not to get the Labor government in power, it's to get the Labor government in power, but on the basis of an extremely more industrial action, greater degree of social movements in the streets. That's the way we're going to guarantee our rights. It's not the Labor government that's going to guarantee that. What's going to guarantee that is that they know if they move against the delegates on the wharf, if they try to finger that, we use the ABCC against the delegate on the construction site, then we're all going to be out. And that's what's great about September the 6th. But the truth is that September the 6th is only in New South Wales. At the moment it is only the CFMEU, and we'll try and rope in as many others as we can, and there'll be several thousand in the street on September the 6th. But that has to be the beginning of more demonstrations in New South Wales, but it also got to be, and this is a word for the comrades who aren't from New South Wales, we need it in Victoria, we need it in Perth, we need it in South Australia, we need it in Brisbane. But in order to do that, the 6th has got to be as big as we can actually, you know, as we can make it. And as you know, Aaron actually, you know, sort of said, I think the task that we have, when their backs against the wall, we can see the way they will get more desperate. We had a whiff of that in Longman and over the by-elections. When their backs are against the wall, they talk about refugees, they talk about migrants, they talk about citizenship, they pump out the racism. It's more, you know, African gangs. And as I said from the front, you know, the gang that we need to get rid of sits in Parliament House. The gang we need to get rid of sits in Canberra. The organised power to do that is in the streets, it's in the workplaces, and I think that's where we need to get organised, and it's that kind of muscle which is going to make the difference, not just about Turnbull, but about the system, you know, we face. So we'll go out on September the 6th, it's got to be the beginning of more of them, we'll look to the comrades, and I think it's a very symbolic action, but it certainly has inspired me, the idea that we'll have marches in Austria and Germany, they will meet on the fence to actually bring down the fences. Okay, it may be one gate on that particular day, it may be one bit of the fence, but I think in that kind of context, we talked about it in the building the refugee movement here, there is a power that can tear down those fences. The more that we exercise those muscles, the sooner the fences come down.